An imbalance between rich and poor is the oldest and most fatal ailment of all republics. My safari business that I'd started picked up immediately, giving me one of the most dangerous things that success can give you, which is the illusion of your exceptionality. What I've come to believe is the most important thing for any entrepreneur to understand is how to manage and thrive in the full market cycle.
Well, good day, friends. This is David Phelps from the Freedom Founders Mastermind Community and Dentist Freedom Blueprint podcast. Today, it's such an honor, such a privilege to have a person who's become not just a good friend, he's a mentor, a colleague in the entrepreneurial space, Mr. Alistair McDonald. Alistair, sir, so good to have you.
Thank you, David. It's my privilege to be here for sure.
Well, the first thing people will note is that one of us has an accent. I'll say it's me because you actually speak the Queen's English. My accent is not so good to listen to. I think I'm going to ask questions and let you speak. The listeners will enjoy that a lot more, but hopefully I can ask some good questions of you today.
If I could just get my kids to be quite as compelled by the accent, my world would look quite different.
Well, Alistair, your background, your history, your life history is one that is just so expansive in experience and knowledge and wisdom, and you're so good about being able to articulate that to the people who you care to share with and provide that wisdom, and people who you lead in different respects of your life. I could give some pieces of that, but I think you probably told the story more times than I have. So why don't I give you a shot and just take us back to growing up and the entrepreneurial background from which you come from, your parents, your grandfather, and just kind of take us through and bring us up a little bit to date, and then we'll carry on with our conversation today.
Yeah, so I'm originally from Zimbabwe in Africa. When I was born, it was the country of Rhodesia. And Rhodesia was going through a pretty torturous civil war as the kind of departing energy and influence of the colonialists, not just the British, but the Germans, the Portuguese, etc., from Africa in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. There was this draining of interest and ability by European powers to continue to sustain and support these distant colonies. And as that capital and attention receded, those that were born and raised there, like myself, I'm a fourth generation Zimbabwean, been there, families 120, 130 years. It was a fairly violent extraction, and what was left was a very small minority of largely white, then Rhodesians, now Zimbabweans, and a large majority of Black Zimbabweans, Rhodesians, that were, as a function of this colonial legacy, there was a disparity of income, there was a disparity of education systems, and so on and so forth. And so this inevitably manifested, interestingly enough, in a large gap between the haves and the have-nots. It was not unique to race, but it was definitely easily identified by race, which was unfortunate, and civil conflict arises. I saw just recently a beautiful quote by Plutarch, who, in fact, if I could recall it exactly, he had said that an imbalance between rich and poor is the oldest and most fatal ailment of all republics. And sure enough, that's what I grew up with. So grew up through a bad civil war. Then coming into the 80s, my family's long line of entrepreneurs and business owners, everybody as far back as I could see, worked for themselves. They didn't even work for each other. They just worked for themselves. So it was almost assumed, at least in my mind, that I would eventually go the same route and start my first business, which I did at 18. It was a safari business. I watched the post-war, post-dark social mood era and the emergence of a booming economy in the 80s and particularly the 90s. And my safari business that I'd started picked up immediately, giving me one of the most dangerous things that success can give you, which is the illusion of your exceptionality, your exceptionalism. And I did. I really thought that I was pretty incredible, only to later discover that at the right timing, everybody looks like a genius. The ensuing contraction in social mood and civil strife and economic implosion happened seemingly overnight. And before I knew it, I was living in a country with the greatest hyperinflation in world history, north of 18 million%. By the time I had employees and so forth, it was, well, I had employees at age 18, but it was extremely difficult environment to navigate. We, if you went out for dinner at night, you had to pay for your food before it arrived because it would cost more by the time it landed on the table. So this environment, needless to say, is not that easy to do business in. You end up with this rush to hard assets, and you're often trading and bartering in hard assets. But nonetheless, I moved to the United States and continued. My safari business rolled into an investment business, which then led to me working on Wall Street, which didn't last very long, largely because I couldn't grow a dorsal fin. I didn't want to stick around and have anything to do with it. It really wasn't about investing at all. It was about sales masquerading as advice, which I've since discovered is everywhere. So I'd enjoyed this great, very early success, expeditions with some of the most prominent organizations. National Geographic commissioned me for a source to sea trip of the Zambezi River. It was a cover story. But I got a little bored, amazingly. I could see boredom on the horizon. And so headed off to the United States and got caught up in another frothy frenzy of the tech bubble, paid the ensuing price, over leveraged, overextended, and underexperienced for an American recessionary contraction, which is really where I went to the mountain, so to speak, to learn Shaolin, to really understand what I've come to believe is the most important thing for any entrepreneur to understand, is how to manage and thrive in the full market cycle, the full economic cycle. So in that time, I've managed assets directly. I was fortuitous enough to call and anticipate the peak in the housing bubble. That bursting was very profitable for me. The financial crisis was the most profitable time of my life. And the subsequent recovery has moved me back into just direct work with entrepreneurs. And that's my quickest, that's the longest elevator speech that could be given. It's a long elevator ride.
But it's perfect because so much of the experience that you just alluded to, the Plutarch's quote about the imbalance between the haves and the have-nots, the chaos, the market volatility, where we are today, full cycle, and that's a term that I really first heard from you. Let's define that a little bit, because some people might not be totally clear what that means and how that relates to the market today. Let's just dive into what do you mean by full cycle entrepreneur or full cycle investor?
So if we look at the oscillations of, say, Apple stock inside of any intraday data set, what we see is oscillations, exactly that. We see these cycles at tiny degrees of scale. Those same cycles play out almost in a fractal type pattern in the broader economy. So we see the waxing and waning of GDP, of unemployment numbers, of taxes fluctuating over time, retroactively, trying to repair prior excess. We watch the expansion and contraction of credit. These are all what we would describe as to watch a full cycle. So, for example, today, as you and I speak, the S&P, just as a proxy for a market, we are outside of a very modest, violent but modest contraction in COVID, rapidly made up, very, very quickly and convincingly. We are really on the back end of what, granted, we had experienced a recession with COVID, but what we've seen, if you look at a chart of the S&P for the last 11 years, 12 years, is what I would call a half market cycle. So a full market cycle includes both the boom and the bust. This is crucial. This is crucial because as investors, we fail to pay attention to where we are in the larger cycle. It's as if we set out on a journey at 6 p.m. in the evening and we forgot that it can actually get dark because it's been light for 12 hours. Since I've been awake, it's been light, and so therefore I'll just sail out into the dark. This is dangerous for a number of reasons, and it comes from our innate inability to really forecast anything. But so I want to come back to forecasting, but the notion of cycles themselves, they'll show up at all different degrees of scale. So if we look at home prices, we've seen expansion and contraction in home prices, political cycles. A full market cycle will look like one from, say, 1925 to 1948. Inside of that, what we have is a full expansion and a full correction. So an investor, I believe, a full cycle investor, which is to say a full cycle entrepreneur, because entrepreneurs are the most active investors in the world. It's not BlackRock and the big hot money that's working arbitrage, squeeze trades, and so forth. It is the dentist who decides to add another op to their practice. It is the employer who brings on another employee. These are investment decisions, and they're based on a forecast. But nonetheless, back to this cycle. If we're going to cultivate an awareness of these cycles, which I've lived through now, this is my 5th complete market cycle, what we'll see is the best way to measure success is market bottom to market bottom, or market peak to market peak. Instead, what we do is measure market bottom to market top. It's a half cycle. So we bring half cycle sophistication to a full cycle phenomenon. The beauty of these cycles is, and I know you and I just got a chance to riff on this privately the other day, is that no opinion is required. No opinion is required. Nobody needs to make any sweeping forecasts to understand reversion to the mean. So let's take, just as we discussed recently, the Case-Shiller year-over-year home price index is up 22.1%. The historical average is somewhere in the order of 6 or 7%, going back for the full set of data. Well, how are we going to get back to a 6 or 7 or even 8% average annual increase on the heels of a 22% boom? Well, again, no opinion required. An average is made of the best of the worst and the worst of the best. This looks like the best of the best. How do we correct for that? The gap between 22 and 8 or 22 and 6 is large. And that reversion to the mean is the mathematical term we might use for a full cycle.
If you enjoyed watching or learning from this video, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel for more content. If you have a question about any of my content or this specific video, just please leave a comment down below. And as always, stay focused on your freedom. I'll see you next time.